There is a scene in Edward Yang's Yi Yi where a married couple sit together after years of living side by side, and one slowly realizes that the crisis in their relationship did not begin at any identifiable moment. Nothing catastrophic has happened recently. There has been no dramatic betrayal capable of explaining the emotional exhaustion between them. Instead, the relationship has thinned gradually under the pressure of ordinary life. Work, routine, private disappointments, emotional habits, exhaustion, and the passing of time have quietly altered the atmosphere between two people who once believed they understood each other completely. What makes the film extraordinary is the absence of easy explanations. Nobody behaves monstrously. Nobody becomes entirely unsympathetic. The relationship weakens through accumulated failures of attention, through conversations postponed indefinitely, through the strange human tendency to assume there will always be another opportunity later to say what mattered. I think people often misunderstand why relationships fail because visible endings create the illusion that relationships collapse suddenly. In reality, emotional distance usually develops invisibly long beforehand. People continue sharing meals, discussing practical matters, attending social gatherings, raising children, making plans, and maintaining the external structure of intimacy long after something essential has begun withdrawing internally. And because daily life continues functioning outwardly, the loss itself becomes difficult to name. Literature has always understood this more deeply than contemporary conversations about relationships. Modern culture increasingly approaches intimacy through the language of self improvement and emotional management. People speak about compatibility with enormous confidence while remaining unable to explain why certain relationships continue haunting them long after they end, or why some deeply unhappy relationships survive for decades. Human beings rarely behave with emotional consistency. A person may desire intimacy while simultaneously fearing exposure. Someone may long for freedom and still remain unable to leave familiar unhappiness behind. Love itself often becomes entangled with memory, class, timing, loneliness, vanity, family history, and the need to feel visible inside another person's imagination. That is why Anna Karenina continues feeling psychologically alive more than a century later. Anna's tragedy emerges gradually through the collision between emotional longing and the rigid structures surrounding her life. She does not simply fall in love with another man. The relationship awakens a version of herself that her existing world can no longer comfortably contain. And Karenin remains fascinating precisely because he is emotionally limited without recognizing it fully. He offers stability, respectability, and structure while remaining incapable of the emotional openness Anna desperately requires. He mistakes restraint for dignity and order for intimacy. Real relationships often fracture through these quieter failures of recognition. Many people spend years feeling fundamentally unseen inside relationships they continue maintaining loyally. The difficulty lies in explaining what exactly is missing because externally everything appears intact. Daily life proceeds normally, responsibilities are fulfilled, conversations continue. Nothing obviously disastrous has occurred. And yet, another person's inner life can slowly become inaccessible despite physical proximity. Ingmar Bergman understood this terrifyingly well in Scenes from a Marriage. The couple speak constantly through the series, yet genuine communication remains elusive because both people spend years protecting carefully constructed versions of themselves. Their marriage survives partly through performance. Each person edits emotional truth in order to preserve stability. The series becomes difficult to watch because one recognizes how ordinary this arrangement actually is. Emotional honesty inside long relationships can be extraordinarily difficult because honesty changes structures. Once certain truths are spoken aloud, relationships rarely return unchanged. So people postpone difficult conversations indefinitely. Silence enters relationships gradually and begins functioning almost like architecture itself, supporting the continuation of ordinary life. This is partly why deeply unhappy relationships sometimes continue for decades. Familiar pain can become easier to inhabit than uncertainty. Shared routines acquire emotional weight independent of affection. People become attached to the structure of a life even after emotional intimacy weakens. Richard Yates explored this brilliantly in Revolutionary Road. Frank and April Wheeler remain trapped partly because both are protecting idealized versions of themselves that no longer correspond to reality. Their marriage survives outwardly through performance, resentment, nostalgia, and the fear of confronting the emptiness beneath their carefully constructed aspirations. The tragedy comes from watching two intelligent people recognize their unhappiness while remaining unable to alter the emotional machinery of their lives. Timing also shapes relationships far more than people comfortably admit. Two people may care deeply for one another while remaining emotionally incompatible within the specific conditions of their lives. Someone seeking stability may encounter someone seeking reinvention. One person may arrive emotionally available precisely when the other has withdrawn inward after disappointment or exhaustion. And sometimes, affection survives while timing fails completely. Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love understands this with extraordinary subtlety. The emotional power of the film comes from the hesitation, repetition, restraint, and proximity. Two people move carefully around one another while remaining separated by circumstance, morality, fear, and timing. Their emotional connection intensifies partly because ordinary life never allows it to settle into practical reality. The relationship survives internally because external fulfillment never arrives to reduce it into familiarity. Many relationships continue existing internally in altered forms long after they disappear externally. A memory connected to a particular city can suddenly reopen an entire emotional atmosphere years later. A passing remark can return unexpectedly decades afterward with undiminished force. Certain relationships never entirely leave consciousness because they remain attached to unfinished emotional possibilities. And these emotional histories often shape future relationships invisibly. People begin protecting themselves from previous injuries without fully recognizing how much of their behavior belongs to earlier experiences rather than present circumstances. James Salter wrote beautifully about this emotional layering. Intimacy in his work rarely produces certainty or permanence. His characters move towards one another while remaining partially isolated inside themselves. Relationships become temporary moments of recognition between two complicated people attempting, with varying degrees of success, to understand another consciousness fully. That feels emotionally truthful to me. Relationships survive less through permanent compatibility than through continued attention. And attention may be one of the rarest forms of love in adult life. To continue observing another person carefully after years together requires resisting the tendency to convert them into certainty. And certainty weakens relationships quietly. Once people begin assuming complete knowledge of another, curiosity fades, attention fades, imagination fades. People begin responding to remembered versions of each other rather than noticing ongoing change. That is why some relationships survive immense difficulty, while others collapse despite apparent harmony. Shared interests, attraction, intellectual compatibility, or social approval rarely sustain intimacy by themselves across decades. Relationships endure through emotional generosity and through the willingness to revise one's understanding of another person repeatedly over time. And many relationships fail because those revisions stop happening. Great literature and cinema remain important, partly because they refuse simplified emotional explanations. They recognize how difficult genuine understanding between people actually is. Affection and resentment frequently coexist. Loyalty survives disappointment. Desire survives exhaustion. Human beings damage what they value while sincerely believing they are protecting it. Stories about relationships continue haunting people because they reveal how fragile understanding remains despite intimacy itself. A person may spend years beside another person while entire emotional territories remain unexplored between them. As the series comes to an end, I realize these episodes have repeatedly circled around attention. Attention towards books, towards art, solitude, aging, and the emotional structures shaping ordinary lives. Relationships belong to the same category. A difficult, ongoing act of noticing another person carefully before familiarity turns them invisible. This has been Notes After Rain, and this is the conclusion of the series.